The slap echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. I watched my disabled son's head snap back as blood trickled from his lip, and I knew our lives had just changed forever. But what happened next? $200,000 in damages. A federal investigation. An entire neighborhood turned upside down. And lives completely destroyed. Because 30 seconds after HOA President Karen slapped my son Evan across the face in front of that judge. He was wearing the judge's robes. Karen would be in handcuffs, an entire HOA would be dissolved, and my son would teach them all what real justice looks like. Let me back up and tell you how we got to that moment. Because what Karen did next was so shocking, so reckless, that even her own supporters couldn't believe it. See, this whole mess started because Evan owned something Karen desperately wanted. Lake access. Pure and simple. Our family had owned waterfront property for over 60 years. My father bought it back in 1962, and when he passed, it went to Evan. The deed came with something precious, a legal easement giving him permanent access to the lake through a small path. But Karen? She'd moved into the neighborhood 3 years ago and decided that easement should belong to her HOA instead. She'd been harassing Evan for months, sending lawyers, filing complaints, trying everything to force him to sign it over. That's why we were in court. Karen was trying to steal my son's lake access through a bogus lawsuit. It started during cross-examination. My son Evan, 46 years old, sitting in his wheelchair with the quiet dignity he'd carried since his young age. He was calmly to the court exactly why easements work the way they do, how they're tied to the deed, not the person. How they can't just be transferred to an HOA because someone decides they want them. His voice was calm, professional. He'd done his homework. He knew the law code, and that's exactly what set Karen off. I watched her face change. You know that look when someone realizes they're about to lose everything? When their whole scheme is falling apart. Karen's jaw tightened. Her hands balled into fists, and something snapped. She shot up from her chair like a rocket. The courtroom went dead silent. Even the judge froze, his face drained of color. He looked like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Karen stormed across that courtroom floor, her heels clicking like bullets on tile. I'm thinking, surely she's not going to. But she was. She absolutely was. The slap came so fast, so hard, that Evan's glasses flew clean off his face. But it wasn't just a slap. Karen was wearing 3 rings on that hand. They cut right into his cheek, opening up a gash that started bleeding immediately. Stop hiding behind your wheelchair and your pity games, she screamed, spit flying from her mouth. The sound that came from the gallery. It was like everyone had been punched in the gut at the same time. Gasps, sharp intakes of breath. One woman actually shrieked. One man cursed under his breath. Even the bailiff looked pale. But here's the part that still makes my blood boil. You know what the HOA board members did? They didn't gasp. They didn't look horrified. They started clapping. Finally! The treasurer shouted, actually applauding. Finally someone had the guts to say it. I felt my chest tighten, my vision blur. This was my son. My boy who'd never hurt a soul. Sitting there with blood running down his face while these people cheered his assault. The judge shot to his feet, his face draining of color. This is unprecedented in my courtroom, he shouted, banging his gavel so hard I thought it might break. Emis, clamp it. Approach the bench immediately. But Karen ignored him completely, still screaming at my son. You could see it in the judge's eyes. He'd never witnessed anything like this. But Karen wasn't done. Oh no, she was just getting started. Frauds like you are what's wrong with America, she screamed, pointing that bloody finger right at his face. You think that wheelchair makes you special? You think we're all supposed to bow down and give you whatever you demand? She was in full meltdown mode now, completely out of control. She just committed assault in front of a judge, a jury, a packed courtroom, and she was doubling down. You're nothing but a con artist playing the victim, a fraud hiding behind pity. And that's when something happened that I'll never forget. Something that should have warned everyone in that room about who they were really dealing with. My son Evan, blood still dripping from his cheek, his glasses on the floor, his medical alert device beeping from the impact. looked up at this woman who just assaulted him, and quietly said, "Are you finished?" Just like that. Calm as you please. "Are you finished?" The entire courtroom held its breath. Even Karen froze for a second. Her face went white. For just a second, she looked like she'd seen a ghost. But then the rage took over again, and she made the biggest mistake of her life. After Karen slapped Evan, after she screamed those horrible things, after her board members actually applauded the assault, my son did something that left everyone in that courtroom speechless. He didn't show pain. He didn't yell back. He didn't even wipe the blood from his face. Evan just sat there, blood trickling down his cheek, and took a slow, deep breath. I watched his chest rise and fall, watched him center himself like he was meditating in the middle of a hurricane. Then he did something that made my heart both break and swell with pride at the same time. He looked directly at me, his old man sitting in the gallery, probably looking as pale as a ghost, and gave me the smallest nod. Like he was saying, "Don't worry, Dad. I've got this." That's when I knew. Whatever Karen thought she'd accomplished with that slap, she just made the worst mistake of her life. Evan reached down and quietly straightened his shirt collar. Didn't make a big show of it, didn't draw attention to himself. Just fixed his clothes with the same care you'd take arranging flowers. The blood was still dripping. He still hadn't wiped it away. And somehow that made him look more dignified, not less. I could see other lawyers in the gallery staring at him. Not with pity, but with something close to awe. One attorney I recognized from other cases actually leaned forward in his seat, like he was witnessing something remarkable. Because here's the thing about my son, and Karen was about to learn this the hard way. Evan doesn't lose his temper. He gets focused. While Karen was still ranting, still pointing fingers and making threats, Evan calmly reached for his legal pad. His movements were precise, methodical. He started taking notes. Not random scribbles, real notes. Exact quotes, marked with timestamps. Every word she spewed documented in his steady hand. "He's documenting everything?" Someone whispered behind me, their voice shaky. Like they just realized this wasn't humiliation. It was preparation. Evan looked up from his pad just once, catching Karen's eye while she spat about fake victims and disability scams. And you know what he did? He smiled. Not a big grin, not something mocking. Just the smallest, calmest smile you've ever seen. Like he knew something she didn't. Karen's voice actually cracked when she saw it. For just a second, her rage faltered, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. But she was too far gone to stop now. Too invested in her performance to realize she was digging her own grave with every word. Evan went back to his notes, still bleeding, still calm as a lake at dawn. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I started to wonder, who exactly was my son? Because the man sitting in that wheelchair, taking notes while blood dried on his face, wasn't just my boy anymore. He was something else entirely. But here's where things got truly disturbing. Because what Karen did next showed everyone in that courtroom that this wasn't her first rodeo. She adjusted her suit jacket like nothing had happened. Like she hadn't just committed assault in front of a judge. The entire room was still in shock. People were staring at the blood on my son's face. And Karen? Karen started talking like she owned the place. "Your Honor," she said, that confident smirk spreading across her face. "I apologize for my passionate response, but sometimes you have to take decisive action to protect your community." I felt my stomach drop. You see, in my 12 years as HOA president in this neighborhood and others before it, I've successfully resolved situations like this before. I've forced out 21 families who refused to cooperate for the good of the community. Families who thought they could ignore HOA authority and do whatever they wanted. The way she said it, so casual, so proud, it was like she was talking about hauling garbage to the curb. One of the other attorneys in the gallery actually gasped. Did she just admit to? But he didn't finish the sentence. Karen kept going, getting bolder by the second. The law is very clear about HOA jurisdiction. We have broad authority over individuals in our neighborhoods. Property values, community standards, access rights, those decisions belong to the HOA board, not to homeowners who think they're special. No matter how much you paid for your house, The HOA is your landlord. You live here because we allow it. I'm sitting there thinking, this woman has lost her mind. But then I looked around the courtroom and realized something terrifying. Some people were nodding, actually agreeing with her. And here's the part that really got to me. Karen looked directly at the judge, the same judge who just witnessed her assault my son, and said, Your Honor, I'm confident you understand that courts generally support HOA authority over individual claims. We represent the community. He represents only himself. The judge looked like he'd been slapped himself. His face was pale. His hands were shaking slightly as he gripped his gavel. Your Honor, I need you to understand, Karen continued, but the judge cut her off. Ms. Clampett, you will stop speaking and return to your seat this instant. But she kept going like he hadn't said a word. Karen saw his attempt at control and pounced on it like a predator smelling weakness. And then she said something that made me realize we weren't just fighting Karen. We were fighting an entire system. This is exactly the kind of case where the court needs to send a clear message. That disability claims can't be used to override HOA authority. That individual property owners can't hold entire neighborhoods hostage with selfish demands. The confidence in her voice, the way she stood there with blood still on her rings, bragging about destroying families. It was like watching a predator that had never been challenged. But as I watched my son still calmly taking notes, still building his case, I couldn't help but think Karen had no idea what was coming for her. And then Karen did something that honestly took my breath away. She looked at that judge, at the jury, at everyone in that courtroom who just watched her assault my son. And she started lying with the confidence of a professional con artist. Your Honor, this man is greedy, she said, pointing at Evan like he was a criminal. He blocked families from accessing the lake. He refused to join our HOA and won't extend his easement rights to benefit the community. He's selfish, manipulative, and he hides behind his disability for sympathy. I felt like I was in an alternate universe. But Karen was just getting started. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a stack of photographs. These photos show the defendant threatening children at the lake, she announced, holding them up like evidence at a murder trial. Families trying to enjoy a peaceful afternoon with their kids, and this man screaming at them, telling them to get off his property. I leaned forward to see the photos. Even from my seat in the gallery, something looked off about them. The lighting was wrong, the angles were weird, but Karen presented them like they were smoking gun evidence. He's been charging families $50 just to access what should be public lake access, she continued, her voice getting stronger, more indignant. $50 for children to go swimming in their own neighborhood. Wait, what? Evan had never charged anyone anything. He barely talked to the neighbors, let alone collected fees from them. Karen wasn't done with her fantasy story. She pulled out what looked like an official petition. I have here a petition signed by over 200 homeowners demanding that Mr. Evan be required to join our HOA and submit to community authority. 200 families who are tired of being held hostage by one selfish individual. She waved that petition like it was the Declaration of Independence. But something about it looked too perfect, too clean, like it had been printed yesterday. And then Karen said something that made my blood boil. Your Honor, I have serious concerns about the legitimacy of his disability claims, she said, lowering her voice like she was sharing a state secret. Our neighbors have reported seeing him walking when he thinks no one is looking, standing up from that wheelchair to reach high shelves, taking steps around his property. The courtroom went dead silent. Even I felt my face flush with anger. This woman had just suggested my son was faking his disability. I can provide witness statements documenting his violent outbursts, Karen continued, gaining momentum from the shocked silence, throwing objects at children, screaming profanities at elderly neighbors, making threatening gestures with his hands. She reached into her briefcase again and pulled out what looked like official documents. Mrs. Baloney from Abbey Street will testify that he threatened to run her down with his wheelchair. Mr. Garcia from Affleck Avenue witnessed him throwing rocks at their family dog. And the Johnsons' sweet elderly couple. They're terrified to walk past his property after he screamed slurs at them. I sat there listening to this woman describe some kind of monster that had absolutely nothing to do with my son. Evan, who helped elderly neighbors with their groceries. Evan, who'd never raised his voice at anyone in his life. But here's what was really terrifying. Some people in that courtroom were buying it. I could see jurors taking notes, nodding slightly. Karen's story was detailed, specific, believable. And she knew it. Karen said, looking directly at the jury. This is about a manipulative individual who thinks he can use sympathy to steal from an entire community. Who thinks he can hide behind a wheelchair to avoid responsibility for his antisocial behavior. She paused, letting that sink in. The real victims here are the 47 families in our HOA who just want their children to have safe access to the lake their property taxes help maintain. Families who've been terrorized by this man's aggressive behavior and are too afraid to speak up. As I watched Karen weave this elaborate web of lies, I realized something chilling. She wasn't just making this up on the spot. This appeared planned, rehearsed, and sitting there in his wheelchair, blood still dried on his cheek. My son continued taking notes, still calm, still focused, but I was starting to wonder, how do you fight someone who lies this skillfully? How do you prove the truth when the lie sounds so believable? And that's when the courtroom turned into something I'd only seen in documentaries about lynch mobs. Karen's board members erupted like they'd been waiting for this moment their whole lives. They started nodding, shouting, feeding off each other's energy in a way that made my skin crawl. Exactly, the treasurer yelled, jumping to his feet. Karen is protecting our property values. This man is selfish, hoarding what should belong to all of us in the community. But that was just the beginning, because what happened next showed me that this wasn't some spontaneous outburst. These people had come prepared. 3 board members suddenly produced printed signs from under their seats. Professional-looking signs that read, "Stop Disability Fraud," in bold red letters. They held them up like they were at a political rally. "Remove his lake access," they started chanting in unison. "It belongs to the HOA. Remove his lake access. It belongs to the HOA." I felt like I was watching a nightmare unfold in real time. This was a courtroom, not a town square. There was a judge sitting right there, a jury watching the circus, and these people were treating it like some kind of protest march. The secretary, a woman who'd seemed reasonable when she first walked in, suddenly stood up and pointed directly at my son. "My taxes shouldn't pay for his entitled lifestyle," she screamed, her face red with rage. "Why should my family sacrifice so one man can play king of the lake?" The worst part? Every time someone tried to object, tried to restore order, the chanting got louder, drowning out every other voice. It was coordinated, calculated. The judge was hammering his gavel so hard I thought it might break. His voice cracked as he shouted for order, but it was hopeless. His authority had vanished under the roar of that mob. And then I watched the gallery split in real time. People were literally choosing sides, moving to different sections of the courtroom. Some families got up and left entirely, disgusted by what they were seeing. Others moved closer to the HOA section, nodding along with the chants. One woman I didn't recognize leaned over to her husband and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "If he's really disabled, why doesn't he just take what the HOA offers and be grateful?" Another man shouted from the back, "These people always play the victim card. Make them prove the disability is real." I felt sick to my stomach. This wasn't about lake access anymore. This wasn't even about HOA rules. This had become something much darker, much more dangerous. But here's what really got to me. Through all of this chaos, all this hatred being directed at him, my son never looked up from his notepad, never flinched, never showed any sign that their words were getting to him. He just kept writing, documenting every chant, every threat, every moment of this coordinated attack. And somewhere in the middle of that mob mentality, I realized something that chilled me to the bone. Karen hadn't just brought board members to court that day. She'd brought an army that was willing to attack a disabled man in a courtroom full of witnesses. But as I watched Evan's calm, methodical note-taking, I couldn't shake the feeling that this army had just made a terrible mistake. Evan wasn't documenting chaos. He was documenting evidence, the kind that would bury them. But Karen wasn't done destroying her own credibility. If anything, the mob's energy seemed to fuel her into an even more dangerous territory. "Your Honor," she said, her voice rising above the settling chaos. "I need to tell this court about the pattern of intimidation and threats I've personally endured from this man." And that's when the lies got so outrageous, so completely unhinged, that even some of her own supporters started looking uncomfortable. "3 weeks ago, he followed me home," Karen declared, pointing at Evan like he was a serial killer. "I was driving back from the grocery store when I noticed his van in my rearview mirror. He followed me right into my driveway. I felt my jaw drop. Evan didn't even drive anymore. His van had been sitting in our garage with a dead battery for 6 months. When I got out of my car, he rolled down his window and made threatening gestures at me," she continued, now gesturing wildly with her hands. "Violent, aggressive motions. I feared for my safety. But wait, it gets worse. He's deliberately blocked access to the lake water itself," Karen announced, like she was revealing some master criminal plot. "He's installed barriers, posted threatening signs, even trained his dog to attack anyone who tries to use the public access point. The woman was describing my son like he was running some kind of fortress operation. Evan's dog was a 12-year-old golden retriever named Buddy who spent most of his time sleeping and could barely bark, let alone attack anyone." Karen reached into her briefcase one more time and pulled out what looked like an official police report. "I was forced to file this complaint with local authorities," she said, waving the document triumphantly, "documenting his pattern of harassment and intimidation. The police take these threats very seriously." I'm staring at this piece of paper, thinking there's no way this is real. When did she file this? What police department? But she was presenting it like it was evidence in a murder trial. The letterhead looked wrong, the signature sloppy, but she waved it like it was gospel. And then Karen's board members decided it was their turn to perform. That's when I realized this wasn't just Karen going off the rails. This was a coordinated attack planned and rehearsed. The treasurer stood up first, his face a mask of fake concern. "We all witnessed his hostile behavior," he announced to the court. "We saw him lunge at President Karen from his wheelchair during our last visit to his house. He had refused to answer our letters. He avoided community meetings. Karen acted professionally at all times, but he was completely out of control." "Wait, what? Lunge from his wheelchair? How does someone in a wheelchair lunge at anyone?" But the secretary was already standing, ready with her part of this twisted script. "I watched Karen save children from his dangerous behavior," she declared, her voice shaking with what I can only describe as theatrical emotion. "There were families at the lake, little kids just trying to swim, and he was screaming at them, threatening to call the police if they didn't leave immediately." She paused, letting her fake tears build up. Karen stepped in to protect those children. She put herself between him and those innocent families. She's a hero. A hero? A hero for slapping a disabled man in a courtroom? But they weren't finished. The HOA attorney, Karen's cousin, stood up with what looked like official documents. "Your Honor, I need to inform the court that Mr. Evan currently owes over $30,000 in unpaid HOA fines," he announced, shuffling through papers like he was presenting a mortgage foreclosure. "Fines that are increasing daily due to late fees and attorney costs. $30,000? For what?" Evan had never even been officially notified of any fines, let alone owed that kind of money. "He's refused every attempt at reasonable negotiation," the attorney continued. "Every offer to settle this matter amicably has been met with hostility and legal threats. I watched this performance, this coordinated character assassination, and felt something I'd never experienced before. Not just anger, not just frustration, but genuine fear. Because these people weren't just lying. They were lying with documents, with fake evidence, with practiced coordination that suggested they'd done this before. Each story was slightly different but supported the others. Each lie built on the previous one. It was masterful in its deception. And the most terrifying part? Some people in that jury box were taking notes, writing down these lies like they were facts. But as I watched this circus of false testimony, I noticed something. Evan had stopped taking notes. For the first time since this nightmare began, he'd put down his pen. He was just sitting there, perfectly still, watching Karen and her board members dig their own graves with every word. And for some reason, that scared me more than anything else that had happened in that courtroom. Because if Evan wasn't writing anymore, it meant he was ready. And just when I thought Karen couldn't sink any lower, she found a way to blame my son for destroying the lives of everyone around him. Without waiting for permission from the judge, without any sense of shame or self-awareness, Karen pressed on with what might have been the most disgusting thing I'd ever heard in my life. And because of him, she declared, pointing that bloody finger at Evan like he was a criminal, I had to make every homeowner in our HOA foot the bill for this case. The audacity of it took my breath away. She was blaming my son for the lawsuit she filed. But Karen was just warming up on this victim-blaming masterpiece. He forced us to drain our children's college savings, she said, her voice cracking like she was about to cry. Families in our community had to choose between their kids' futures and protecting their homes. I felt like I was living in an alternate reality. My son, who hadn't wanted this fight, who just wanted to be left alone on his own property, was now supposedly responsible for other people's financial decisions? This man deliberately delayed every proceeding, Karen continued, building momentum like a revival preacher. Every time we tried to reach a reasonable settlement, he demanded more time, more depositions, more expert witnesses. His manipulation tactics forced us to hire expensive consultants just to prove our basic community rights. Manipulation tactics? Evan had represented himself through most of this process. He'd asked for exactly one extension, and that was because he'd been in the hospital. But Karen wasn't finished painting my son as some kind of financial terrorist. Hardworking families have been forced to take second mortgages, she declared, her voice rising into righteous fury. Grandparents dipping into their retirement. Young couples postponing children because they can't afford both a baby and the legal fees this man's greed has cost us. She was describing financial apocalypse and laying it all at the feet of a man in a wheelchair who just wanted to keep his lake access. And then she delivered what might have been the most outrageous line of the entire day. He has financially destroyed 47 families with his selfish greed, Karen proclaimed, pressing her hand to her chest like she was reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. 47 families who just wanted their children to have access to the lake their property taxes already help maintain. I sat there, mouth hanging open, trying to process what I just heard. According to Karen's twisted version of reality, my son was single-handedly bankrupting an entire neighborhood from behind his wheelchair. The sheer victim-blaming insanity of it was almost impressive. Here was a woman who had filed a bogus lawsuit, assaulted my son in open court, and harassed him for months, and somehow he was the villain destroying everyone's life. But what chilled me most was this. Some people were buying it. I saw nods in the jury box, pens scratching notes. One woman in the gallery even wiped away a tear when Karen mentioned the kids' college futures. And through it all, my son just sat there, still calm, still taking notes, still bleeding from where this woman had struck him. But I realized something then. Every lie Karen told, every false accusation, every piece of victim-blaming garbage. It was all being carefully documented by someone who clearly knew exactly what he was doing. Karen thought she was destroying Evan's reputation. But with every word, she was only tightening the rope around her own neck. But while Karen was busy destroying herself with every word, something else was happening that I almost missed at first. My son wasn't just taking notes anymore. He was building something. I watched Evan organize his legal pad with the precision of a surgeon. Each lie Karen told was being categorized, time-stamped, cross-referenced. He had columns for perjury, columns for civil rights violations, columns for contempt of court. This wasn't anger. This wasn't emotion. This was professional. Evan caught my eye across the courtroom and gave me the slightest nod. Not reassurance this time. Recognition. Like he was telling me, "Dad, you're about to see something." Other attorneys in the gallery were starting to notice too. I saw one lean over to his colleague and whisper something. The colleague's eyes went wide as he looked at Evan's methodical documentation. Even the court reporter kept glancing over at my son. She could see him marking exact timestamps for each of Karen's statements, noting when the lies contradicted each other. And that's when Karen's cousin decided to join the party. The HOA attorney stood up, and I immediately knew we were about to witness something even worse than what we'd already seen. "Full disclosure, Karen Clampett is my cousin," he announced proudly. The reaction was immediate. Someone from the gallery shouted, "Conflict of interest." Other attorneys started murmuring among themselves. I saw one lawyer actually cover his face with his hands, like he couldn't believe what he was witnessing. The bailiff stepped forward and spoke quietly to the court clerk, who started writing furiously. "Noting conflict of interest disclosure for the record," the bailiff announced. But Karen's cousin just smiled and continued like nothing had happened. I could see other lawyers in the gallery exchanging horrified looks. One attorney I recognized mouthed unethical to his colleague. Another was already pulling out his phone, probably to report this to the state bar. I felt my stomach drop. This was about to get ugly. "Mr. Evan believes the HOA is part of some vast conspiracy against homeowners," the attorney continued, reading from papers that looked real enough to fool anyone who wasn't paying close attention. "He has bluntly refused to join, despite the overwhelming Democratic vote from the HOA members that he should." Karen was nodding along like this was gospel. The courtroom went dead silent. Even Karen's supporters looked uncomfortable with this nuclear option. But Karen was just getting warmed up for her final act of cruelty. She stood up again, pointed that finger across the courtroom one more time, and said something that made me want to climb over the railing and drag her out myself. "He knows exactly what he's doing," she declared, her voice dripping with disgust. "He knows if he cries about HOA oppression and throws in the disability card, America, who already loves to hate everything about HOAs, will automatically take his side. It's calculated manipulation." The phrase disability card echoed through that room like poison. Gasps rippled from the gallery. Even one juror shook his head in disbelief. But Karen wasn't done. "That wheelchair is just a prop for internet sympathy," Karen announced, like she was exposing some grand conspiracy. "A tool for getting what he wants without having to work for it like the rest of us." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This woman was suggesting my son was using a wheelchair as a prop. "He's even trained his old father to play along," she said, gesturing toward me in the gallery. "Look at him sitting there trying to look sympathetic. Probably planning to post this whole thing online for victim points." That was it. That was the line. I started to rise from my seat, fury boiling. But then I saw Evan. Still calm, still writing, still completely in control. And somehow that stopped me cold. "This is what's wrong with disability handouts in America," Karen declared, hitting her final disgusting note. "People who game the system, who use sympathy as currency, who think society owes them special treatment just because life got hard." The moral outrage I felt in that moment was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. She wasn't just attacking my son. She was attacking everything decent about helping people who need it. But here's what was really remarkable. Through all of this, my son never once looked up from his notes. He just kept writing, documenting every word. And that's when I noticed something that gave me chills. The bailiff had been watching Evan this whole time. Not with suspicion, but with what looked like recognition. He leaned over to the court clerk and whispered something that made her eyes go wide. The court stenographer had stopped looking at Karen entirely. She was watching Evan's note-taking with the fascination of someone seeing a master at work. And Evan himself? I could see him quietly correcting legal errors under his breath. When Karen's cousin misquoted a statute, Evan shook his head slightly and wrote the correct citation. When they cited a precedent that didn't exist, he wrote one word in block letters. False. This wasn't a man being humiliated. This was a man who knew exactly where this was all heading. In his defendant's chair, blood still dried on his cheek from where Karen had struck him. My son sat with a kind of serene control that I'd never seen before, like he was watching people dig their own graves and taking careful measurements of the depth. And then Karen decided to go for the nuclear option. She stormed back toward my son like a woman possessed. The entire gallery gasped and flinched backward, everyone thinking the same thing. She was going to hit him again. But what she did next was somehow even more disgusting. Karen stopped right in front of Evan's wheelchair, looked down at him with pure hatred, and sneered. "You think that wheelchair and your pity act will save you? People like you don't belong here," Karen shrieked, her voice cracking. "And when I'm done with you," she added, yanking out her phone and waving it like a weapon, "you'll be famous on social media as the fraud you really are. Everyone will know you're a fake." She leaned down, her face twisted, and hissed words that chilled me to my core. "Pathetic. You'll never win. You picked the wrong person to mess with." Then, straightening like she owned the place, she declared, "This court will always side with American HOAs over people like him." The confidence in her voice, the absolute certainty she was untouchable. It was terrifying. But that's when everything started to fall apart. The judge, who had sat frozen through this entire nightmare, suddenly looked like he was about to have a breakdown himself. The judge stood up abruptly, his hands visibly shaking. "That's enough," he declared, his voice cracking with emotion. "I have presided over this court for 15 years, and I have never witnessed such a deliberate assault on the dignity of these proceedings. I cannot and will not continue." He looked directly at Karen. "Your behavior has made it impossible for me to remain impartial. I am recusing myself effective immediately." He rubbed his temples like he had the worst headache of his life. Gasps echoed and rippled through the courtroom like waves. Jurors looked at each other in disbelief. Karen's supporters erupted in cheers like it was a touchdown. "We won!" one of them shouted. "Mistrial means we win." The noise was deafening. Karen was actually laughing, high-fiving her board members like she'd just been crowned queen. And that's when the stress finally got to me. I felt the room spinning, my vision going dark around the edges. The last thing I remember before passing out was thinking, we've lost. After everything, we've lost. When I came to a few seconds later, family members were fanning me with their programs. But the chaos in the courtroom had only gotten worse. The court reporter had stopped typing and was just staring at the scene in confusion. Karen was still celebrating. The judge looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. That's when the bailiff, looking shell-shocked but trying to maintain some kind of order, stepped forward. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice cutting through the noise. "Until a replacement judge can be found and appointed, emergency court protocol requires that the most senior licensed attorney present maintain order and oversee proceedings." The courtroom fell dead silent. "This is emergency protocol established in 1947, the bailiff continued, pulling out an official manual. "All licensed attorneys present must submit their credentials and bar admission dates for verification." I watched Karen's lawyer, her cousin, practically puff up with pride like a rooster. He was already reaching for his briefcase, clearly assuming he'd be taking over. "Finally," Karen whispered to her board, "someone with sense will be in charge." Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Does this mean Karen wins? If there's a mistrial, what happens? This is insane. The bailiff started calling out for attorneys to present their credentials. One by one, lawyers in the gallery stood up and stated their bar admission dates. Karen's cousin was practically bouncing with excitement. "Licensed in 2019, he announced proudly. Another attorney called out, 2015. A woman near the back, 2018. The tension was building. Everyone could feel it. Karen was smirking like she'd already won. And then the bailiff said something that changed everything. "Are there any other licensed attorneys present who haven't identified themselves?" The courtroom was silent. Karen's celebration was starting up again. That's when my son slowly, painfully, raised his hand. "That would be me," Evan said quietly. The courtroom went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Karen's jaw literally fell open. "You? How could you possibly be judge-level educated?" The bailiff walked over to Evan's wheelchair. "Sir, I'll need to see your credentials and bar admission date." And that's when my son, blood still dried on his cheek from where this woman had assaulted him, looked up and said, "Evan Livingston, Harvard Law School, Law Review Editor." Licensed to practice in federal court. Bar admission date, 2005. The silence was deafening. The bailiff's eyes went wide as he examined Evan's credentials. Sir, it says here you have 20 years of civil rights law experience and federal court certification. Karen had gone from smirking to staring to what looked like complete shock. She literally collapsed back into her chair. That's impossible, she whispered. The bailiff looked around the courtroom. Mr. Livingston, as the most senior attorney present, emergency protocol requires that you assume judicial duties until a replacement can be appointed. The gallery erupted in gasps and shocked murmurs. Even the original judge was staring with what looked like visible respect and relief. As the bailiff brought over the judicial robe and placed it on my son's shoulders, I watched the blood still visible on Evan's face catch the courtroom lights. Here was my boy, assaulted and humiliated, being sworn in as the judge in his own case. Karen's face had gone from confident to confused to absolutely terrified. And sitting there in that wheelchair, wearing those robes, my son looked up at the woman who had spent the last hour trying to destroy him and said, in the calmest voice I'd ever heard, "Court will resume in 5 minutes." The transformation was instantaneous and devastating. Karen staggered backward like she'd been physically struck. Her face went through every stage of grief in about 10 seconds. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and something that looked like the acceptance of her own doom. "No, that's impossible," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But the evidence was right there in the bailiff's hands. Harvard law credentials, federal court certification, 20 years of civil rights experience. And then it hit her, really hit her. She'd just spent the last hour calling a Harvard-trained federal civil rights attorney a fraud. She'd assaulted him. She'd mocked disability rights in front of someone who'd made a career defending them. Karen's legs gave out completely. She didn't just sit down. She collapsed backward into her chair so hard it rolled several feet. Her mouth was hanging open like she was trying to catch flies. The HOA board members looked like they'd seen a ghost. The treasurer was frantically gathering his papers, clearly trying to make a run for it. The secretary had gone pale as paper and was whispering what sounded like prayers under her breath. But the best reaction came from Karen's cousin, the HOA attorney. The man who just spent 20 minutes attacking Evan's credibility suddenly realized he'd been going toe-to-toe with someone who probably knew more about civil rights law than he'd learned in 3 lifetimes. He actually dropped his briefcase. Just let it fall to the floor with a loud thud that echoed through the silent courtroom. "Oh my God!" I heard him whisper. "Oh my God! What have I done?" Karen's husband, who'd been sitting quietly in the back row through this entire nightmare, buried his face in his hands. His shoulders were shaking, and I couldn't tell if he was crying or just trying to disappear. People in the gallery were pulling out their phones, recording Karen's complete meltdown. Her confident smirk had been replaced by the hollow stare of someone watching her entire world collapse in real time. "This can't be happening," she kept mumbling. "This can't be happening." But it was happening, and it was about to get so much worse for her. The bailiff looked around the courtroom, took a deep breath, and made the announcement that would change everything. "All rise." The Honorable Acting Judge Evan Livingston presiding. The change in the room was electric. My son straightened in his wheelchair, and suddenly everything about him was different. Gone was the quiet, patient man who'd been documenting abuse for the last hour. In his place was someone with real authority, real power. When Evan spoke, his voice carried a weight that silenced every whisper in that courtroom. "Please be seated," he said, and I swear you could hear a pin drop. Karen couldn't even look at him. She kept staring at her hands, her whole body trembling like she was in shock. The HOA board members huddled together like frightened children. The treasurer was actually shaking. The secretary looked like she might throw up. But the gallery? The gallery was watching with the kind of rapt attention you see at a really good movie. People were leaning forward in their seats, sensing that they were about to witness something extraordinary. Even the jurors were nodding, pens forgotten, eyes fixed on Evan. Even the bailiff stood straighter. I could see the respect in his eyes as he looked at my son. This wasn't just emergency protocol anymore. This was a real judge with real authority, about to deliver real justice. Evan adjusted his robes with the same calm precision he'd used to take notes all day. Then he looked up at the woman who had spent the last hour trying to destroy him. "Now then," he said, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom, "let's address the accusations that have been made here today. Instead of anger, instead of emotion, my son delivered something far more devastating. Cold, precise legal analysis. Ms. Clampett, you have alleged that I am illegally blocking community access to the lake." Evan began, reaching into his folder with movements so calm they were almost hypnotic. "Let me show the court the actual facts." He produced a document that looked old and official. The paper was yellowed with age, but the writing was clear. "This is the original easement deed, filed with the county recorder on March 15, 1952. It clearly establishes perpetual lake access rights tied specifically to my property deed." He held it up so the gallery could see it. Karen's eyes darted to the document, then quickly away, like she couldn't bear to look at the evidence of her lies. "Legal fact," Evan continued, his voice taking on the authority of someone who'd spent decades in courtrooms. "Easement rights are personal to the deed holder. They cannot be transferred, sold, or assigned to a homeowners association without the explicit consent of the easement holder." I watched Karen shrink further into her chair with every word. "Ms. Clampett also claimed I was required to join the HOA," Evan said, producing another document. "These are the HOA incorporation papers, filed in 2019. As you can see, my property predates the HOA's existence by 67 years. The math was lethal. Karen had demanded he join an organization that legally had zero jurisdiction over him. The cousin leapt up, stammering, "Objection." Evan didn't even glance at him. "Noted. Overruled. On the law." The cousin sat back down, face red, utterly humiliated. "Furthermore," Evan continued, pulling out a stack of emails, his voice never rising but somehow filling the entire courtroom with authority. "The evidence shows that Ms. Clampett knew this case was unwinnable before filing. These communications, which will be entered into evidence, show that Ms. Clampett consulted with 3 different attorneys before this lawsuit. All 3 advised her that the case had no legal merit." Karen's face went from pale to gray. She'd been caught not just lying, but knowingly filing a frivolous lawsuit. She filed anyway, misleading her entire community, Evan said, looking directly at the HOA board members who were now trying to physically distance themselves from Karen. She forced 47 families to fund a lawsuit she knew they could not win. The treasurer actually stood up, pointing at Karen. "You told us we had a strong case. You said it was a slam dunk. Please remain seated," Evan said, calm as ice. But the damage was done. The board was turning against Karen in real time. "But my son wasn't finished. Not even close." "And finally," Evan said, his tone dropping lower, heavier, "this court has witnessed systematic perjury." He continued, pulling out more documents. Ms. Clampett presented forged photographs, a fabricated petition, and false witness statements. Each accusation hit Karen like a physical blow. She was hunched over in her chair now, looking like she wanted to disappear completely. "This represents not just perjury, but conspiracy to commit fraud," Evan said, his voice carrying the weight of 20 years of legal experience. "The evidence shows a coordinated effort to manufacture evidence and suborn perjury. This is a coordinated attempt to deceive the court." I could see people in the gallery exchanging looks. They were starting to understand the scope of what Karen had done. This wasn't just a property dispute anymore. This was a criminal conspiracy. Karen hunched forward, gray-faced, like she was trying to vanish into her chair. Jurors were nodding furiously now. One leaned forward so far I thought he might fall out of the box. People in the gallery were whispering, "Fraud! She's done." And sitting there in his judicial robes, blood still visible on his cheek from where she'd struck him, my son was methodically, professionally, destroying every lie Karen told. "Let the record reflect," he said evenly, that Ms. Clampett's actions have crossed from civil dispute into potential criminal territory, and this court is not without remedies for such misconduct. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Karen had picked a fight with the wrong man, and now she was about to find out exactly what that mistake was going to cost her. That's when the dam broke. Karen went pale as a ghost as homeowners in the gallery turned to stare at her with growing fury. The murmurs started low but built like a gathering storm. "She lied to us?" someone called out. "Did she make us pay for this knowing we could never win?" A man in the third row stood up, his face red with rage. "You told us this was about protecting our property values. Give us our money back," a woman shouted, pointing directly at Karen. "You stole our life savings." I watched in fascination as Karen's army of supporters began abandoning ship. People who'd been sitting near the HOA section literally got up and moved away from her, like she was radioactive. The HOA board members started pointing fingers at each other like children caught stealing cookies. "I told you this was a bad idea," the secretary hissed at the treasurer. "You said Karen knew what she was doing," he shot back. The gallery had turned completely hostile toward the HOA leadership. These were the same people who'd been cheering Karen an hour ago, and now they looked like they wanted to lynch her. But Evan wasn't finished dismantling her life. "The evidence also reveals," my son continued, his voice cutting through the chaos with surgical precision, "that Ms. Clampett weaponized her HOA position to pursue a personal vendetta." He pulled out what looked like a thick file folder. "Ms. Clampett initiated this harassment campaign after I declined her personal advances at a neighborhood barbecue in July 2023. The courtroom erupted in gasps. Karen buried her face in her hands. "The pattern of targeting extends beyond me," Evan continued, flipping through documents with the precision of a surgeon. "These records show she systematically targeted disabled residents, elderly homeowners, and minority families throughout her tenure." He held up bank statements. HOA funds were illegally diverted to hire private investigators to harass residents she deemed undesirable. Over 3 years, she documented civil rights violations affecting 17 families. The scope of Karen's corruption was staggering. This wasn't just about lake access. This was systematic abuse of power on a massive scale. "Her pattern of harassment and intimidation," Evan said, looking directly at Karen's crumpled form, "represents multiple federal civil rights violations spanning 3 years. The crowd's reaction was explosive. $200,000, someone shouted, calculating the financial damage. "She cost us $200,000 for her personal revenge." A woman near the back pulled out her phone and started live streaming. "You're seeing this live, folks. The HOA president who scammed an entire neighborhood." I looked over at my family section and saw tears streaming down my own face. After all the stress, all the fear, all the humiliation, my son was finally free to show them who he really was. A local news reporter in the gallery was scribbling notes so furiously I thought his pen might catch fire. This was about to become national news. Several homeowners actually approached our family section, looking ashamed. "I'm so sorry," one elderly woman whispered to me. "We should have known better." But the most beautiful moment was watching my son deliver the final verdict. "Ms. Clampett," Evan said, his voice carrying the full weight of judicial authority, "you have committed perjury under oath." Each charge hit like a gavel strike. "You have misused HOA funds for personal vendettas." Karen's shoulders shook with what looked like silent sobs. "You have assaulted a licensed attorney in open court." The blood on his face was still visible, making the irony crystal clear. "And you have systematically scammed your own neighbors." The gallery erupted, but this time, their fury was directed entirely at Karen and her board members. But Evan still wasn't finished. "Therefore," he said, reaching for his gavel, "I am issuing an immediate arrest warrant for Ms. Clampett on charges of perjury, assault, and conspiracy to commit fraud." The bailiff stepped forward, handcuffs ready. "I am ordering an emergency asset freeze on all HOA accounts pending investigation." Karen's head snapped up. Without those accounts, she had no way to pay for lawyers. "I am referring this case to federal prosecutors for civil rights violations." The words "federal prosecutors" sent a chill through the room. This was no longer a local matter. I am issuing a restraining order protecting all previous victims of HOA harassment. 17 families would finally be safe from Karen's abuse. And I am ordering the immediate dissolution of this HOA pending new elections with proper oversight. The corrupt organization that had terrorized the neighborhood for years was finished. The bailiff approached Karen with handcuffs. She looked up at him with empty, defeated eyes. "Karen Clampett, you're under arrest." As the cuffs clicked shut around her wrists, the irony was perfect. The woman who'd spent years making other people's lives miserable was finally facing consequences for her actions. But the ultimate justice was still to come. "This case is dismissed with prejudice," Evan announced, bringing his gavel down with finality. "Meaning the HOA can never file this action again." The sound of that gavel echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot, but this time, it was the sound of freedom. Furthermore, Evan continued as Karen was led away in handcuffs. "I am ordering the HOA to repay all misused dues to affected homeowners. Ms. Clampett is permanently barred from any HOA leadership position." As we left the courthouse that day, I learned the rest of the story from news reports. The homeowners didn't just sue Karen personally. They won. Every penny she'd stolen plus damages. Karen went bankrupt within 6 months and was forced to sell her house. She moved in with distant relatives in another state, a broken woman. The federal housing investigation expanded to 12 other HOAs that Karen had consulted for. Her methods had spread like a virus through the system. My son? He was appointed to the Federal Disability Rights Commission. The same man Karen had called a fraud became a national advocate for the rights she tried to destroy. The neighborhood received $2.3 million in damages for the harassment victims. Every family she'd terrorized got justice. And Karen's mugshot? It became an internet meme symbolizing everything wrong with HOA abuse of power. But the most satisfying part was this. The neighborhood that had once cheered Karen's cruelty became a model community for inclusive housing. For the first time in years, disabled families, elderly residents, and minorities felt safe living there. In the end, the very homeowners who'd once supported Karen turned against her completely. They made sure she carried the crushing weight of all the legal bills from both lawsuits. As I watched my son will out of that courthouse, still wearing his judicial robes, blood finally cleaned from his face, I realized something important. Karen had thought she was destroying a helpless disabled man. Instead, she'd awakened a force for justice that would protect vulnerable people for years to come. For the first time in years, our neighborhood was truly free. If you believe in standing up to bullies, show your support by hitting that like button right now. Every like sends a message that discrimination has no place in our communities. Drop a comment below sharing your own experiences. Your voice helps others feel less alone in their fights. And if you want to see more stories like this, smash that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Your support helps us bring you more stories of the amazing things that happen when ordinary people refuse to give up. So subscribe, like, comment, and share this video with anyone who needs to remember that standing up for what's right is always worth it. Bullies like Karen are counting on your silence. Don't give them that power. See you in our next video. Talesoak.